So, moving on to our next segment, then, I suppose. First, I want to start by asking, well, I'm doing this first because someone in the chat asked if I had ever done a video on the Iraq War. And while I've done plenty of TikToks on it and stuff, I realized I had never done like a deep dive going into like a Marxist analysis of the Iraq War. And there's probably a lot of youngsters in our audience who were born maybe even after 2003 or who don't really remember the Bush administration and the Iraq War. So, first of all, I want to ask, especially Noah, I guess, because you're a little bit older than Carlos and I. Do you remember the war? Do you remember the propaganda surrounding it? Do you remember the post 9/11 anti-Muslim fervor? And what do you remember from that time?
Dude, it was great. It was a really horrible, dark time in this country's history. The propaganda really is what sort of sprang to the front of my mind when you mentioned that. And I remember being in a card shop when I was younger. I was like 19, I think, when 9/11 happened. So right after that, a year after that, and there were trading cards of American like generals and officers being sold, and like a real picture on one side, and then like an artistic rendition of them like strangling an Iraqi soldier. Right? There was one I remember that there was like a big cardboard cutout of, and it was Norman Schwarzkopf, who was at the time commanding. He was a general commanding all of the American forces in this invasion. And it had him on the front, just like, standing. And then the next one on the other side was him holding a gun like this, standing on like a pile of smoking ruins and skeletons. The image is like burned in my mind. But between 9/11 and the Iraq War, there was so much just anti-Islamic fervor, anything brown was called Muslim and attacked. There was a Lebanese family that owned the grocery store 2 blocks from my house, and like every window was busted out. The store was looted a couple times, and these people have nothing to do with Saudi Arabia or terrorists or anything. It was a really, really dark time.
How about you, Carlos? You got any personal stories or anything you remember from it?
The propaganda was quite rampant, of course, and what I remember from that time, maybe a little bit after, was like a Lupe Fiasco song about 9/11, and I started to see some of the conspiracy theories that started developing out of that. And I've talked to Ramiro before about this. He mentioned that, for a lot of people, those conspiracy theories were like segues into like an accurate understanding of like the imperialist nature of the war, of the propaganda. But I think still today, we're seeing a lot of similar, maybe not to the same extent, but similar forms of dehumanizing propaganda with the Russians. And I think that one of the things that we can extrapolate, the sort of general characteristic, is that whoever becomes an enemy of, U.S., Euro-American finance capital and imperialism ends up being, not just attacked for their own right, but also dehumanized. And racist dehumanization has always been a fundamental role of otherizing the people who were labeling the enemy in the interest of capital, and in convincing the populace of the country that's waging the war to go along with the drumming war drums. So,
absolutely. I mean, the invasion of Iraq was part of this broader war on terror that was essentially just anti-Muslim rhetoric and propaganda used to justify imperialist warfare, obviously on behalf of finance capital. And something had to replace the Cold War. That was what it was for years. It's us versus communism. It's us versus the Soviets. Well, there's no more Soviet Union, and NATO, was formed to supposedly prevent the expansion of the Soviet Union. And yet, You have the NATO carpet bombing of Serbia and the destruction of that country at the end of the 90s. And then in 2001, the invasion of Afghanistan. 2003, the invasion of Iraq. So the U.S. needed some way to justify their continued warfare other than just anti-communism. And it just became there's too many extremists in the Middle East, in this region. Ignore the fact, don't talk about the fact that, we've been supporting and funding and arming those extremists when it suits our interests for the last 20 years. But we just got to go and fight them and take them all out. And I remember, like, as a kid, it's interesting talking about the you guys remember it from your personal experience with the war. But I remember as a kid spending so much time thinking about religion, and like I was raised in a religious household, and I would just think, how is their religion so violent? How does their religion push people to kill other people? That just doesn't make any sense to me. And as I began to find the truth and the material factors behind the war and their country devolving into civil war, and find that it was the U.S. backing these extremist groups. It was the U.S. who tried to set up a government based on identity and based on religion and based on ethnicity, when the Iraqis had never done anything like that before. They had always been a secular government until the U.S. came and tried to set up this government based on identity, threw the country into chaos, and then you have the emergence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Wait, Eddie,
material factors. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Eddie, no, are you trying to tell me it's not because they hate our freedom? I could have sworn the president told us that back in the day.
But they had weapons of mass destruction.
Put that picture back up.
Wild.
The weapons of mass destruction thing is interesting to me. What is also interesting is it coming on the heels of the fall of the Soviet Union, right? It is always, always, always about the establishment's need to, one, overcome the falling rate of profit, and two, find avenues of speculation because of this. And it's always going to be sort of the corporations driving this, and the domination of the U.S. after the fall of the Soviet Union was their chance to sort of try to bandage the crises that capitalism creates, right? Without the Soviet Union there, in order to promote all of this speculation and buying of, billion-dollar jets and nukes, etc., and building up, it would fall apart. That's what all of the violence in the Middle East has been about the entire time. And they play on the sort of white chauvinism of our history in order to further that goal. And like Carlos was saying, otherize people. And I mentioned earlier that it was anything brown, and it really, really was. I had Mexican friends who were mistaken for Muslims and harassed. It's crazy. It's just, it's always capitalism, right?
Yeah, and
just real quick, our friend Alan Freeman says it's capitalism, stupid, all the time, right? And that's it.
And the beauty or the evil of using religion as your scapegoat and saying it's just that the Muslim religion is so inherently violent that's why all this fighting is going on, is that conceals the real truth. It conceals the relations of production. If you can look into the religion of Islam as long as you want, trust me, I have, you're never going to be able to find something that, justifies something like ISIS. You have to look at the material factors, which when you understand those, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. They had a secular government that was just completely overthrown, and the U.S. brought back a bunch of Iraqi exiles to try and run the government. And there was a power vacuum that was created. But I want to jump into talking about the Gulf War a little bit, because Noah, you mentioned the long history of destabilizing Iraq. And yeah, the Iraq War didn't start, as is the case with most U.S. imperialist projects. It didn't start with the invasion. It didn't start in 2003. Oftentimes the Gulf War is like glossed over in history classes, But George Bush's father in 1990 was the first American president to attack Iraq. So Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, partly over an oil dispute, partly over wanting some revenge from the Iraq-Iran war.
He got American permission for that too. They didn't step foot in Kuwait without asking America first.
I didn't even have that written down in my facts, but that is incredible too. So they gave him permission to invade Kuwait, and then because of using the Carter Doctrine, which says that the U.S. is obligated to protect Saudi Arabia, they took fake satellite images, showed them to the Saudi monarchs, the Saudi king, and got the go-ahead to start bombing Iraq. Said, look, Iraqi troops are at your border. We have these satellite images, which were fake, and used the Iraq invasion of Kuwait that they gave Iraq the thumbs up to do to begin attacking Iraq. And if you see, I pulled up a map here. We're a little zoomed out, but here's Saudi Arabia, here's Kuwait, and here's Iraq. So Iraq went into Kuwait. The U.S. said we need to defend Saudi Arabia, even though Iraq had no intention of going into Saudi Arabia. And there you go. That was all the justification that they needed to start bombing Iraq, which they did, killing 200,000 people, according to Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds, which he got the statistics from some global organization that counts things like that. 200,000 people were killed. The bombings destroyed the Iraqi infrastructure, and then the sanctions that followed the bombings were the worst part. That's where over 500,000 children, not just people, but 500,000 children were killed by starvation and disease as a direct result of the sanctions. And as Noah said, when these bombings were kicking off, Saddam Hussein was literally wondering what's going on. Where's the Soviet Union? Why is it being allowed to happen? And it's because in 1990, the Soviet Union was already in the process of dissolving. So they could no longer provide this umbrella of protection over the developing world through the UN Security Council the way that they had for years. So, and we talk about also the disaster that the collapse of the Soviet Union was for the world. This is what we mean. A report from the UN said that Iraq, after these sanctions and bombings, were in a pre-industrial state that was near apocalyptic. So Iraq was turned from a secular government, developing country into a pre-industrial state where people were starving, and 500,000 children were killed by U.S. sanctions. So this also, the beginning of the Gulf War and the sanctions on Iraq that happened because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I like to conceptualize this as a qualitative shift in U.S. foreign policy and a qualitative shift in the stance of Western imperialism from the Cold War to the war on terror, quote unquote, which was used to justify the intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Palestine, so much more. It can all kind of be lumped together, but the Soviet Union collapsed. So the Cold War was over, so there needed to be a new way to convince Americans why we should perpetually be at war, especially with the Middle East where there's all this oil. So 9/11 gave them, a perfect propaganda tool as well, but it was happening before that, right? It was in 1990 when this qualitative shift happened, not in 2003.
And not only that, it keeps us distracted and gives us something to hate that isn't our own ruling class, just like they give us each other to hate right now in the working class. What I find really, really fascinating about the Iraq War and Saddam Hussein as a historical figure in particular is he was America's boy for a long time. He worked with the CIA. They funded him. They sort of encouraged him to, and they were fine with him killing the entire left wing of the Ba'athist Party in his country, including his cousin. Was it Sadiq, I think, or Qasim, maybe? They were fine with all of this. They were fine with crackdowns, whatever he needed to do to consolidate power from the opposition. They backed. It was not until he wanted to increase Iraq's share of international oil markets, right, in order to build up infrastructure in Iraq and not give all of this capital to the super majors or the finance cartels, that they had a problem, right? That was when the problem began. And it was downhill from there. And then the slant drilling thing and all that.
And I think that one of the saddest things is that people have still not learned, because they're still holding on to, what Eddie calls hindsight, anti-imperialism. Like they're able to oppose wars 10, 15, 20 years down the line, but when similar dynamics are at play right in front of them, and all the lapdog media of the ruling class is shouting at you, telling you that if you don't accept our opinion, you're a Putinist, and Putin is Hitler, so basically you're a Nazi. When that's going on in front of them, all the lessons, yeah, Putler, all the lessons that they supposedly learned from Iraq, Afghanistan, take your pick, it all goes out the window. And the if you follow these events and how they unfold, they take a similar trajectory. They're planned way ahead of time. I put a video in the private chat. I don't know if you want to pull it up, but it's General Wesley Clark talking about how, a few years ahead of time, they had a list of 7 countries that they had to invade. He's I believe a CIA official or something, and he goes back. He had retired, and he goes back, and they tell him, now we're going into Iraq, and then we're going into Iran, and then then we're going here, and then we're going there. And if you really track the trajectory of the countries, it's the ones that had the most oil. So there's an economic logic behind all of this, but you can't understand that properly unless you have the Marxist outlook. And I've been recently getting a lot into Lukács's work on irrationalism as the route that bourgeois philosophy has to take, because if it treats reason with any respect and tries to approach the world rationally and understand it, it's forced to come to terms with the world through a dialectical materialist worldview, and therefore to come to conclusions which align it with the Marxist. But it's more committed to the existing order than to truth, and therefore it has to land itself in some form of irrationalism. And I think you look at the discourse of all these people, whether it's around Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, or now in the proxy war against Russia, and the sort of same irrationalism appears over and over and over again. You can't tell me that, the newspapers that were talking about the Nazi problem in Ukraine, 8 years ago, and who are still putting pictures with peoples with swastikas. You can't tell me that them saying there's no fascist or Nazi problem in Ukraine is not an act of utter irrationalism. And, the same thing took place in all of these different wars.
Yeah, and a perfect transition from that is after the Gulf War, and after we knew that the U.S. had bombed Iraq to a pre-industrial state, caused 500 million children to starve or die of disease, and this war had been justified by the fake satellite photos that we talked about, as well as a fake testimony that's now famous called the Naira testimony, where the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador said that the Iraqi troops were taking babies out of incubators and leaving them on the floor to die. Well, in fact, they found out this was atrocity propaganda to justify the war, but by then it was too late, and Iraq was already in this pre-industrial, near-apocalyptic state. So after that, on 60 Minutes in 1996, I believe, then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked, 500 million.
But to correct the number, it's 500,000.
Children died from this. Would you say that's worth it? And you can see your answer for yourself.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
So there you heard it straight from her mouth. You want to talk about forcing yourself to end up in a place of irrationalism. You're literally presented with the statistic. You killed 500 million children based on a bunch of lies. And she says straight up, we think it was worth it.
That's such a softball question too. Like, if it was presented in a game show, it'd be like one of the first ones that are, for $5, is it worth killing 500,000 children? It's a very clear no in every. It doesn't matter what the situation is. It's a very clear no. I don't like using the word evil, because it connotes very religious underpinnings that I personally don't have. But I don't know what else to call these people other than evil. They're the personifications of the greatest evil that has killed more people in humanity than I can count. So it's disgusting.
What's really tragic about the whole thing is that they've never been held accountable for this. Right? They lap their way to the bank. They're all, millionaires and billionaires. And it's disgusting. And it's going to take regular people standing up, getting organized and fighting back in a real way to hold them accountable for these kind of things. On a somewhat lighter note, Michael Parenti has a very funny joke about the Naria. Is it Naria or Naraya? Or I always said
Naira,
Naria.
I think.
Naira? I always said Naria in my head because I'm stupid. But or dumb American, right? I can't pronounce anything and not in English. But he said that like they must have been the world's biggest incubator place in the world. Just premature babies, just every single birth in all of Iraq for that to actually make sense.
It's so absurd sometimes, the propaganda. It's like the stuff you hear about North Korea, like Yeonmi Park. Oh, yeah, at the hospitals they eat rats, and then the rats eat people, and then the people eat the rats. It's just a cycle. Like, how many rats are in this hospital? Like, that doesn't even make sense.
It's crazy to me that people like think they actually believe these things. They can suspend their disbelief to this wild world where reality is actually a cartoon, where, Kim Jong-un is feeding people to piranhas, like just crazy, insane things that if you think about it for 2 seconds, you're like, that's stupid. Like if you made a movie about that, I would say that's stupid to unrealistic. Don't do it,
Right. I want to say too, Noah, you were mentioning how these people have never been held accountable and they laughed their way to the bank. That reminds me of something else Parenti says, that George Bush was not dumb, right? His evils were not like an accident. It wasn't just idiocy, right? He knew what he was doing, and he was portraying himself like an actor, as this hokey guy from Texas, from the South, who doesn't realize that he's massacring people on behalf of finance capital in the military industrial complex. He absolutely knew. Right. He absolutely knew what he was doing. And he's a cold, calculating neoconservative. And a lot of the people, if you don't think he knew, like, look at his family history. And his dad's administration was Colin Powell when they were doing the Gulf War. Then Colin Powell would go on to be in the Bush administration and be the one who would lie about the WMDs. Or he was Joint Chief of Staff. So one of the military leaders. Not in the administration, but him, George Bush the elder and George Bush George Bush the younger had the same people in their administration. They both killed millions in the same country, right? So he knew exactly what he was doing. He was following in his father and his grandfather's footsteps, as we'll talk about a little bit later too. And Madeleine Albright, when she died, was lauded as this courageous woman. I mean, I have a bunch of the things that people said about her written down. Anthony Blinken said who's now our current Secretary of State, right? Is that his exact position? Pretty much the person crafting Biden's foreign policy and policy in Ukraine. He said about Madeleine Albright, this lady who said killing 500,000 people was worth it. She was a brilliant diplomat, a visionary leader, a courageous trailblazer, a dedicated mentor, and a great and good person who loved the United States. And Joe Biden said hers were the hands that turned the tide of history, which is definitely true for the 500,000 people she killed. Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, said she was saddened to hear of the news of at Madeleine Albright's death. She was a force for freedom and an outspoken champion of hashtag NATO, an inspirational colleague and friend. My deepest condolences to her family and the American people. Jen Stoltenberg makes no mention of the Iraqi people, probably because Madeleine Albright killed 500,000 of them, not million. Over a million.
Not to mention the American working people they stole from to kill those people. You know?
Yes, and sent to fight and die, and
right. They basically used us as bullets.
Right. The last quote I have was Progressive Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who said she was devastated to hear of the passing of Albright. As a war survivor, she demonstrated remarkable empathy for those facing violence and inhumanity throughout her career. So it's progressives, it's Democrats, it's Republicans, it's all these folks in the State Department and the White House and these arms of the financial oligarchy who are praising Madeleine Albright, this arch neoconservative. So this reminds me of the George Carlin quote, "It's a big club and you ain't in it." That's all it comes down to. Those big houses that we saw flying over Washington, D.C., that's where the big club hangs out, and we're not in it.
And that's such a basic thing to figure out. I feel like that's already figured out by the vast majority of Americans. I mean, if you look at the polls in terms of dissatisfaction with representatives, only around 20% of the people feel like their representatives are representing them. And if you look at the polls of the amount of people that disagree with both parties and would want an alternative third party, it's like 60 something, almost 70%. So the vast majority of people know this. They know very clearly that the two parties don't represent them, that they represent a class that they're clearly not in, that it's a big club and they're not in it, as you correctly referenced, Carlin saying. And, what's very tough is that very basic level of understanding is not shared by people who should share it, because they call them people who call themselves Marxists or Marxist-Leninists and communists, who would still, say that, yeah, but this one side of the club is more fun or is less evil, and therefore we should continue voting and canvassing and fighting to have this one side of the club elected as opposed to the other one. So it's, in a certain sense, the organizations which are supposed to function as the highest expression of social consciousness are behind the consciousness of the American people, who already are very much anti-establishment.
Absolutely. So we haven't even talked about the Iraq War. Yeah, we've just made it through the Gulf War. But I mean, it's important to understand that, because everything has its roots in history, right? Everything has a historical development. Nothing just showed up here. And when you're talking about the Iraq War, which was perpetrated or led up by George W. Bush, and his father literally started a war against Iraq 10 years ago, you need to understand the one to understand the other. But if we want to go even further back, Prescott Bush was the father of George H.W. Bush, who did the Gulf War, and the grandfather of George W. Bush, who did the Iraq War. And he was a finance capitalist, politician, and weapons contractor in the 20th century, or throughout the early and mid 20th century. Really one of the original architects of the military-industrial complex. One of the original, people who jumped around between political office, banking, the head of weapons contractors, the head of a steel company, and really was an archetype of that revolving door. Lenin talks about how at the turn of the century, from 19th to 20th, that's when the qualitative change happens and capitalism becomes monopoly capitalism, dominated by finance capitalists and banks, which is capitalism in its imperialist stage. And that's when capitalism needs to go abroad and super exploit other countries. And in America, Prescott Bush was one of the finance capitalists leading this up. He was born in 1890, I believe, so born right before the qualitative shift to the stage of imperialism happens. And imperialism helped build the Bush family fortune. And Dwight Eisenhower was warning us about the military-industrial complex before he left office in the 1960s. and that was, or the early 1960s, and that was, right when Prescott Bush was at his peak, at his prominence. The other way that he made his fortune was through allying with Nazi Germany. I swear to God, he was one of the financial architects of Hitler's rise to power, and the Nazis who would attempt to take over the world. So really think about that, and the fact that, thank you, Carlos. Think about that and the fact that two of his offspring, or two of his heredity, then rose to the highest office in America and immediately attacked other countries and tried to maintain dominance over the whole world. So he continued funding, or Prescott continued funding Hitler's rise to power even well after Americans knew about the concentration camps and the massacres. And the money he made in Germany helped kick off the Bush family fortune, like I said, which absolutely that generational wealth played a vital role in allowing George H.W. and George W. to become president. And then these freaking oligarchs had the nerve, the gall, to try and give us Jeb Bush in 2016. They're like, this guy's even stupider than the rest of them, but you'll probably take him, you dumb Americans. And Donald Trump busted up that plan for the neoconservatives that year. But yeah, Bush family legacy.
I wonder how the American people would feel if they knew these things. That, this is a Nazi family that got to start allying with the Nazis. Was Prescott Bush one of the people involved in the attempt at a fascist coup here, or am I wrong about that?
I don't know if he was. I mean, it's hard to say because there was so much concentration and so much connection between the shareholders.
Right.
I'm sure we don't know everyone involved, but I didn't see that he wasn't like one of the direct ones or one of the ones who was caught.
It strikes me as amazing that, especially after World War II, people could be okay with this literal, like, the family that became their oppressor through allying with the Nazis, that so many Americans heroically sacrifice themselves to defeat. It's wild, man.
Absolutely. I feel like George Bush, Prescott Bush was one of the architects of the military industrial complex, which was emerging in the 60s. I feel like you can look at George W. Bush as a complete capture of the government, not just by finance capital, but by the military industrial complex themselves.
And the sort of deep state too.
Right. Yes. The deep state's another good way to put it. Like him and his father and Prescott Bush were all part of Yale and the Skull and Bone Society and all this weird stuff.
Well, not to mention the CIA,
Right. Which is just, stuff that stems from a total concentration of power to the point where there's like this wealthy club of people who think that they literally run the world, which is how we get these political dynasties like the Clintons and the Bushes. But, the fact that his father and his grandfather were who we were, and then the fact that he immediately appointed Dick Cheney, who is literally the chairman of Halliburton, like literally the chairman of a weapons contractor. So, between the 60s when Eisenhower was warning us about the formation of the military industrial complex, which was headed up, like I said, by Prescott Bush, then you have Prescott Bush's heredity 40 years later, claiming the government, actually taking power of the government, saying, guess who runs the government now? The chairman of Halliburton. Let's go invade Iraq.
It's when people these days, like, they don't really talk about the Bush era much. And I think it's an area of history that really, really needs talked about more because it directly builds where we're at today. But a lot of people, they when they sort of become aware of society being broken, they look at Trump as this anti-establishment guy. And he has the exact same kind of appointments that both Bushes did, though. Just like Dick Cheney was appointed, Rex Tillerson, right? The CEO of Exxon was appointed his Secretary of State, right? That's insane. That's not an anti-establishment guy. That is someone very much in with the establishment, trying to appear anti-establishment because it's hip now.
And if you're talking about clubs in the sense of like where they're participating in their social life, they're all in the same clubs. Like the social circles that they all hang out with are the same. There's a million and one photos of all these people together, and pictures of them with Epstein. So it's to have one of the big hitters from those clubs present themselves as an anti-establishment figure. I don't know if there's any clearer case of how successful the ruling class is in presenting establishment uh, discourse as anti-establishment, or establishment movements as anti-establishment.
Absolutely. I think the Bush administration is understudied, like you said, Noah, both Bush administrations, because I mean, and not like we kind of take it for granted. Like, if you know the Iraq war was a sham, like most people do, and a lot of people who were around for the era of George Bush, kind of by the time he left office in 2008, it was almost like he was a laughing stock. But his image has been rehabilitated by, liberal media and Republican media. And there are a lot of young people getting into politics now who never experienced George Bush, don't know who George Bush is. Like, when I look at, or I mean, it's crazy how fast time goes by, is what I was trying to say. And how many new people can vote every year who were like born in 2003 or 2004. It seems crazy. Like, how is that possible? But it is. That's how time works, I guess. But there are a lot of people who don't know about George Bush, and like you said, there are people who are still around in the State Department and in the government from the Bush administration. Elliot Abrams is one. John Bolton is another, who was appointed by Trump. Like you said, people were portraying Trump as an anti-imperialist, especially now, that he's out of office. It's easier to kind of try and rewrite everybody's memory, because the things that Trump did are less fresh in our minds. But today, when I was researching this, I was like, Trump had John Bolton as his national security advisor or whatever. Like, that is the most bloodthirsty, blatantly pro-war neocon who's ever walked this earth.
Yeah.
To try and call him anti-imperialist when he appointed John Bolton is hilarious.